10. Sugar's calories make you thin, they say. The inclusion of large amounts of sugar can affect our diet in two ways. It can be taken in addition to the normal diet, or instead of a calorie equivalent in some other food. More likely than either of these alone, it can be done both ways, by adding something to the total calories and also displacing some other foods. Since, as I showed, sugar supplies nearly 1/5 of the average eater's calories, no aspect of sugar consumption can be ignored. Its effects will be particularly evident in those many people whose intake of sugar is appreciably greater than the average. The consumption of sugar on top of an ordinary diet increases the risk of obesity. The consumption of sugar instead of part of an adequate diet increases the risk of nutritional deficiencies. In this chapter, I want to deal with the question of sugar consumption leading to an increase in calorie intake. I have already pointed out that the average intake of sugar in America or Britain supplies some 500 to 550 calories a day. But this is not the whole picture. Many people take at least twice as much as the average of 4.5 or 5 ounces a day. They are getting at least 1,000 calories a day from sugar, and 1,500 calories or even more is not unknown. This sounds enormous, but I am not counting visible sugar alone. Such people consume only part of this daily quota as sugar by itself. Moreover, much is taken with other foods that supply lots of calories. Cocoa in chocolate, fat in ice cream, fat and flour in biscuits and cakes. This adds up to even more calories than the figures I have just given. This book is not about obesity and its causes and treatment, so I shall mention only 2 matters that are particularly relevant to the question of sugar. One obvious, one less obvious, and only recently properly investigated. The obvious one is that people take sweet foods and drinks because they like them. And just as you will eat less than you need if your food is unpalatable and unappetizing, so you will eat more than you need if it is especially appetizing. Let me remind you of some of the points I made in Chapter 2. Most often, people eat chocolate or cake because they are tempted by their appearance and taste, and not because they really need those extra calories. And when people take sugary soft drinks, they usually do so because they are thirsty rather than because they are hungry, even though the drinks supply lots of calories, probably not needed, along with the water that is needed. Thus, people often eat and drink to satisfy appetite for pleasure, rather than to satisfy hunger. It is worth spending a moment or two more on this distinction between appetite and hunger. What are the foods that make overweight people overeat? Mostly, people don't become overweight because they eat too much meat or fish, or too many eggs, or too much fruit or vegetables. It is almost always that they eat too much bread, or sweets and chocolates, or cakes and biscuits, or because they drink too many sugary cups of tea or soft drinks. Or, of course, it may be because they drink too much beer or other alcoholic drink. Now just think. When people put sugar in their tea or coffee, is it because they are hungry and need the extra calories, or is it that they prefer the beverage sweet? If it were really a question of caloric needs, then they would be adding the sugar only when they were hungry. Or take someone who goes to the pub after his supper and drinks 2 or 3 pints of beer with his friends. Is this because he is short of calories? Does he go to the pub only when he is hungry? Or does he drink just half a pint during the evening when he has had a particularly large meal at home? And what about the woman who sits in front of the television after supper with a box of chocolates on her lap? Does she eat only 1 chocolate because she had a large dinner that night, compared with the half box of chocolates she ate the previous night when she was really hungry? The fact is that on both occasions she nibbles chocolates because she likes them, and this has nothing whatever to do with her hunger. In general, people take sugar or sugary foods or drinks or alcohol for pleasure. The calories they inevitably get at the same time are quite incidental and have nothing to do with the satisfaction they get from consuming these items. When you come to think of it, almost all of the tempting foods that are taken to satisfy appetite rather than hunger contain carbohydrate that is either sugar or starch, or they contain alcohol. This was confirmed when my colleague, Diane Addy, and I carried out a survey among more than 1,400 women who were members of Slimming Magazine's Slimming Club. We asked them to tell us which of a long list of foods they had found difficult to resist when they were overweight. 25% put cakes and biscuits at the top of the list, and a total of 72% named carbohydrate-rich foods as their main temptation. 64% of the listed foods contained added refined sugar, while of the other 16 foods mentioned, none scored more than 4%. These carbohydrate-rich foods, by the way, have another characteristic. They are all artificial foods that do not exist in nature in the form in which we can eat them. As I have said elsewhere, people are not likely to get fat if they make up their diet mostly from the foods that were available to our prehistoric ancestors, like meat, fish, eggs, fruit and vegetables, while as far as possible avoiding manufactured foods, most of which are carbohydrate-rich. The fact is that, given the choice, people eat the foods that they like, and the more they like them, the more they are likely to eat them. You may think this is so obvious that it is unnecessary to say it, but this simple fact accounts for most obesity. If you find that difficult to accept because of lack of proof, let me recall a story in Bernard Shaw's The Adventures of the Black Girl in Her Search for God. In her wandering, the girl comes across a scientist, clearly meant to be Pavlov, who is experimenting with a dog. When asked what he is doing, he says he has discovered that when he shows the dog a piece of meat, the dog salivates. But everybody knows that, says the black girl. Maybe, answers the scientist, but until I did the experiment, it wasn't scientifically established. So what about establishing scientifically that the availability of very attractive foods causes obesity? During the last few years, research workers have discovered that the simplest way of producing a fat rat is not to offer it only the simple pellets that make up the very nutritious food normally given to rats, but to let it also have a go at eating cakes, biscuits, chocolates, and so on. Rats eat this sort of food with enthusiasm, and a very effective fattening diet it turns out to be. So now it is supported by experiment that such highly attractive foods promote overeating and obesity. When you come to think of it, the fact that a low-carbohydrate diet is an effective way of losing excessive weight also suggests that obesity is caused by eating the irresistible high-carbohydrate foods. The low-carbohydrate diet severely limits just those foods that, as we saw, people find most tempting, while allowing you to eat as much as you like of foods such as meat and fish and vegetables. You lose weight because these last are food the body needs to satisfy hunger and not just to satisfy appetite, so you stop eating when you have had enough. This is not to say that these foods are in the slightest degree unappetizing. They do not, however, encourage overeating. It should also be remembered that low-carbohydrate foods are the ones that happen to contain a high concentration of the nutrients that the body needs. Now let me try and explain why there are some people who consume quite a lot of sugar but are not overweight. There are 3 reasons why this can happen. The first would apply to those whose sugar intake is matched by a corresponding reduction in other foods, so that they are not taking excessive calories, although, as I shall show, they may be running the risk of nutritional deficiency. The second reason may be that they are extremely active people, so that they take a lot of calories but also use them up. The third possible reason why people might eat a lot of sugar and still not put on weight is controversial. There is now evidence that some lucky people's bodies have the facility of burning off surplus calories. Sometimes this increase in metabolism is just the equivalent of the extra calories they take, and so they do not put on weight. This view is not universally accepted in the textbooks of physiology and nutrition, but I find the evidence is now quite convincing. Even these people, of course, have a limit to the number of surplus calories they can dispose of in this way. They too will put on weight if their intake of calories is in excess of disposal. If you are one of the lucky ones who can get rid of excessive calories from sugar, you may not get fat, but by no means will you escape its other ill effects: tooth decay, indigestion, diabetes, coronary thrombosis, and all the other conditions I shall discuss. These are not necessarily avoided by people who can eat lots of sugar without getting fat. So there is no point in worrying whether or not everyone agrees that metabolism can increase in response to an increase of food consumption. Let us just say that you cannot help getting fat if you are taking in more calories than you can dispose of. And a very obvious and potent source of excessive calories is the consumption of food and drinks that contain sugar, largely because people find them so delicious. It may be that you are one of those people who finds it difficult to accept that sugar can be an important factor in producing obesity. In America, especially, an intensive advertising and public relations campaign has been in progress for several years to convince the public that sugar has nothing to do with getting fat. First, you are told that a spoon of sugar contains only 18 calories. The advertisements say, "Sugar's got what it takes. Only 18 calories to the teaspoon, and it's all energy." This is quite true, provided you use a rather small spoon and make sure it is a level spoonful rather than the more usual heaped spoonful. Our research experience shows that most people take the sort of spoonful that gives them more like 30 calories than 18 calories. You might want to work out how much sugar you take just in tea and coffee. Suppose you take an average number of cups, which is about 6 a day. Suppose you take the not ridiculously large amount of 2 spoons in a cup, each giving only 25 calories. That is 50 calories a cup and 300 calories at the end of the day. This is what the whole truth is likely to be, rather than the partial and misleading truth about 18 calories a spoon. There is also a second point. The sugar people tell you not only that sugar does not make you fat, they say it actually helps to make you slim. Their argument goes like this. People get hungry because they have a low level of glucose in the blood. If you eat sugar, you stop being hungry because it is very rapidly digested and absorbed, so that the level of glucose in the blood rises. Have a little sugar from time to time then, and you will end up eating less and so reduce your weight. Here is a quote from a sugar industry advertisement. "Willpower fans, the search is over. And guess where it's at? In sugar. Sugar works faster than any other food to turn your appetite down, turn energy up. Spoil your appetite with sugar, and you could come up with willpower. Sugar, only 18 calories per teaspoon, and it's all energy." Unfortunately, there are 3 flaws in this argument. The first is the idea that your eating is controlled by the level of your blood sugar. This theory has now largely been discarded. There is quite a lot of evidence that it is not correct, and certainly that it is not a complete explanation of what controls hunger. Second, there is no reason to believe that just because it is absorbed quickly, sugar will affect your appetite any more than any other food will. Third, there is absolutely no evidence at all that the sugar reduces your hunger to an extent greater than the calories you have derived from it. Suppose you have just taken 2 spoons of sugar in each of 2 cups of coffee, and thus gained 100 calories. You are now less hungry, so you eat less. But by how much? 100 calories, 50 calories, 300 calories? The only evidence I know of suggests that your appetite is reduced by less than the calories you have taken from the sugar. This evidence came from some tests I carried out some years ago, when the same "lose weight by eating more" story was being noised about, though in relation not to ordinary sugar, sucrose, but to glucose. The idea was that you took about 1/3 of an ounce of glucose 3 times a day, a little while before each meal. Then you followed a calorie-restricted diet, and you were supposed to be able to do this more easily because the glucose had reduced your hunger. What I did was to take 2 groups of overweight people and put them on the same calorie-reduced diet, one in fact designed by the manufacturers of the glucose tablets, with or without the additional glucose. At the end of 6 weeks, people taking the glucose had indeed lost weight, a matter of 6¾ pounds, but the people on the same diet without the glucose had lost about 11½ pounds, nearly 5 pounds more, or close to twice as much. You might think then that the glucose did nothing at all, that the people who consumed it ate the same amount of their diet as the others, but lost less because of the extra calories from the glucose. But in fact, this would only account for about 1 pound of the difference, not the 5 pounds or so that we found. The only explanation seems to be that the glucose tablets actually increased the amount that people ate on their calorie-restricted diet, exactly the opposite of what it was supposed to do. I suppose it is natural for the vast and powerful sugar interests to seek to protect themselves, since in the wealthier countries, sugar makes a greater contribution to our diets, measured in calories, than does meat or bread or any other single commodity. But what is always sad is to see scientists being persuaded to support the sorts of claims I have just described. Is it because they like sugar just as much as other people do? Or is it because at least some of them have still not got around to accepting the idea that all carbohydrates don't behave in the same way in the body? Or is it that they have persuaded themselves that the modern scourge is too much fat in the diet, and so they have difficulty in admitting that they may have been wrong? Equally, it is difficult to see why any nutritionist should endorse the consumption of sugar at the present level. What with the high prevalence of obesity, there is no acceptable reason for recommending that sugar intake should not be reduced, or that it should be reduced only as part of a general reduction of food. It is, after all, the only food that supplies nothing whatever in the way of nutrients. It is, remember, the claim of the sugar refiners themselves that their product is virtually 100% pure. It supplies nothing whatever other than calories, and calories are all that matter in weight reduction. Cutting down on any other food, is bound to reduce nutrients as well as calories. There is no evidence that overweight people are taking an excess of nutrients, but there is quite a lot of evidence to suggest that some of them could do with a nutritionally better balanced diet. I shall have more to say about this question of calories and nutrients in the next chapter. The proof of the pudding is in the eating, or in this case, in the not eating. Many people lose excessive weight very successfully simply by giving up sugar, or by severely restricting it. If you take 1 spoon of sugar in each cup of tea or coffee, and you drink only 5 cups a day, you might lose 10 pounds of weight in a year just by eliminating the sugar in your coffee or tea. Sometimes, in order to reduce their weight to acceptable levels, people also need to restrict starchy foods and so adopt a strict low-carbohydrate diet. Of course, giving up sugary and starchy foods and sugary drinks requires some self-discipline, as does any alteration in dietary habits. But for several reasons, described in detail in my earlier book, This Slimming Business, the low-carbohydrate diet is the most sensible and effective way of controlling body weight, and my colleagues and I have demonstrated by experiment, not simply by armchair calculation, that this kind of diet gives a far better supply of nutrients than is made available under the orthodox regime that involves eating the same foods as before, only less. I have never really understood why so many doctors in the American medical and nutritional establishments have frowned upon a diet that tells you, in effect, to reduce only or chiefly those foods that give you the calories you don't need while giving you little of the nutrients you do need. Although I said I was not going to go into details about the principles of obesity, I must add one important point about babies. I have already mentioned the custom, increasingly common among parents, of adding sugar to milk formulas and to the cereal and other foods on which babies are weaned, as well as giving them sugary drinks. The result is the number of fat babies to be seen everywhere, to the extent that pediatric authorities in the United States and the United Kingdom have frequently drawn attention to the problem. A few years ago, it was suggested that the overfeeding of babies not only made them fat, but encouraged the development and persistence of obesity when they became adults. The story was that the fat cells in the baby's adipose tissue are encouraged by overeating to divide, so that not only do the existing cells become full of fat, but the body produces more cells in order to accommodate still more fat. This idea was based on the finding that the number of cells that could be seen in the adipose tissue of fat babies was greater than the number in thin babies. These extra cells persist into adulthood, so that the fat baby becomes an adult with more adipose tissue and hence a greater propensity to store fat. Such a person, it was concluded, would clearly have a greater problem in controlling excessive weight than one with a normal amount of adipose tissue. More recently, this suggestion has been challenged on the grounds that it depends on the ability to count accurately the number of cells in the adipose tissue. The critics say that in thin babies, some of the cells are empty and can easily be missed when they are counted. In a fat baby, the cells all contain fat and are therefore more visible and likely to be counted. This leads to what the critics believe is the mistaken conclusion that there are fewer fat cells in thin babies than in fat babies. Whatever the truth about fat cell numbers, what is certain is that babies, like older children and adults, get fat if they take in more calories than they use. And you only have to look around you to see how easy it is for a baby to get these excessive calories. Even though some manufacturers of baby foods have stopped putting sugar in their products, mothers will do so with little hesitation. Nor do they hesitate to give their babies sugary drinks in their bottles whenever they believe that the little ones are thirsty.